Welcome to episode 5 of the Yes You Coaching podcast. I'm your host, Anna Manning, and today we're going to be talking about perfectionism. So, I'm going to start with the definition of perfectionism because if you look it up in the dictionary or on Google, there is a shed load of things and they all look slightly different. So, good start. When I'm talking about perfectionism, I'm talking about a refusal to accept any standard short of perfection. And if we think about it in terms of the person, a perfectionist is designed as a person who refuses to accept any standard short of perfection. So I think there's another definition that I notice when I'm coaching people, and I want to share that too. I think it's the belief or idea that I have to be perfect. So usually when we're thinking about perfectionism, we think about, I'm perfecting my work, I'm perfecting this report, I'm perfecting this task. But when I see perfectionism, when we actually dig into it with people, what I tend to see is they think they, as a person, as their identity, have to be perfect. And that includes everything that they put out. So it's not about perfecting the work. It's almost about I have to be perfect and therefore everything that flows from me has to be perfect too. Pretty high standard for any human being. I think you will agree. So my first brush really with thinking about perfectionism, I was applying for a job. This was about, 10 years ago. I was applying for a job and I really wanted this job and I'd done all my interview prep and I'd been mugging up and it was the day before and all my nice clothes were ready and laid out. And I was chatting to a friend that evening and I was saying, I've been prepping the questions and all of this. And she said, they might ask you to tell them about your weaknesses. And I was like, you what? My weaknesses? Never heard this before. And she said, yeah, they ask you about that in interviews. They ask you to talk about your weaknesses. And I was like, oh my God, what am I supposed to say? That I'm completely disorganized, that I rush stuff, that sometimes I get so annoyed if people are going on for too long, I stare at the clock in a kind of passive-aggressive way. And she said, no, tell them you're a perfectionist. That's what everyone does. She was like, it's like the perfect thing to say because it's actually a strength dressed up as a weakness. So there I am, 10 p.m. at night, hunched over this laptop, Googling good answers to the interview question, what is your weakness? And perfectionism just kept popping up. So I think maybe not anymore, but maybe we used to have this idea that perfectionism was this wonderful thing that we should all aim for. And whilst I think that it does and it can have some effects that are beneficial, especially for your employer, right, or your clients, if you're always, perfecting everything and making everything perfect, a lot of people come to me saying, I have really, really, really high standards, I identify as a perfectionist and it's not sustainable. Or it's really really hard. Or they come to me saying, I'm just not as confident as I want to be at work. And when we dig into it, one of the things we find out is perfectionism is lurking underneath there. So part of the reason they're not as confident as they want to be is because they set these massively high standards and then they beat themselves up when they, like a normal human being, can't always reach them. So we're going to have a little squiz through perfectionism today, and I'm going to look at it through the lens of what you are thinking and feeling and doing. So what is it that you're thinking as a perfectionist? What are those thoughts and beliefs that are in your head that are creating those actions that you're taking of perfecting everything and checking an email 20 million times, etc., right? What are you thinking? And when I've explored this with people, some of the things that they've told me is they're thinking that mistakes are unacceptable, that every single thing has to be perfect, that if they get something wrong, everybody will, have thoughts and ideas about them. They'll be somehow diminished in people's views. People have also told me that they're thinking that they won't be recognized as being an expert in their area unless they know everything. So there's some of the thoughts that people shared with me when they were thinking about perfectionism. What is it for you? What are you thinking and believing around things having to be perfect? It's worth having a think about, because those thoughts are essentially ruling how you feel and what you do. They are the things that are driving perfectionism. And even if at the moment they're unconscious, it's really worthwhile spending some time trying to make them conscious, right? Trying to bring them to the front of your mind, get them out of your brain, get them onto a piece of paper, or just recognize what they are. Because it may be once you recognize what they are, you don't even agree with them. But whilst you don't know what they are, or they're just unconscious, they are the programming which is impacting everything you feel and you do. So good to know what they are. The next lens we're going to look at this through, so we're going to look at it through what am I thinking, what am I feeling, and what am I doing, is what am I feeling? How am I feeling? And you can imagine that if you were thinking and believing those thoughts that I just shared, you might feel pretty bad. So I did a training for 25 people this week around perfectionism, and they said some of the feelings that they feel are sick, anxious, stressed, overwhelmed. And then people were kind of talking, they were like, is this sort of background feeling of discomfort? And one person described it as a kind of flappy feeling. Maybe that resonates with you, but none of the feelings that people were describing sounded very comfortable, shall we say. Now, I'm not in the business of telling you one feeling is good and one feeling is bad, right? All of them, for better or worse, are part of the human experience, right? But all the feelings that people were describing around perfectionism sounded pretty uncomfortable. Anxiety, stress, overwhelm, sick, tense. They were not good. So, what are you feeling when you're believing that everything has to be perfect and you're a perfectionist? What do you notice happens in your body? Maybe you tense up your shoulders. Maybe you kind of clench your jaw. Maybe you feel anxious in your chest. So one of the things that I looked at when I was preparing this podcast was the link in the research between perfectionism and stress and anxiety. And there is overwhelming evidence in the research that perfectionism is linked with stress and anxiety. And you can see why, right? If you were believing that everything had to be perfect all the time, and you've got a certain amount of hours in the day, so it's unlikely that everything can be perfect, or you make everything perfect despite having a lot of things to do and despite having a heavy workload, no wonder you're feeling overwhelmed. No wonder you're feeling stressed. No wonder you're feeling anxious. So if you think that being a perfectionist or thinking that everything has to be perfect is creating like stress and anxiety for you, not surprising, very well established, and actually fairly normal when it comes to perfectionism. So we've looked at it through the lens of what are you thinking and feeling. Now we're going to look at it through the lens of what are you doing? When you're feeling anxious, stressed, sick, and overwhelmed because you're thinking everything has to be perfect, I can't get anything wrong, I can't tolerate a mistake, and you're feeling anxious, sick, overwhelmed, stressed, what are you actually doing? What does that look like in terms of your behavior? Now, again, I asked this training group, like, what do you actually do? What does this look like on the outside? If I was watching a film of you, what would I see? And they said things like writing and rewriting an email 10 times. even though I knew it was absolutely fine. Researching and Googling things for a report when I knew there wasn't really a right answer. Redrafting. Making tiny little amendments that probably didn't make a substantive difference to what I was doing. And then people told me procrastination was a massive thing that you would see them doing. So I guess because all those feelings are quite uncomfortable to experience, right? You don't really want to feel stressed. You don't really want to feel anxious. What would you rather do instead? Probably get up and make a cup of tea. Probably eat some biscuits. Probably tackle any other piece of work, right? Putting stuff off, passing stuff to the end of your desk, like pretending it isn't there. Giving yourself shorter deadlines, right? As well as the perfecting and the redrafting, there was just completely ignoring. That was one of the things that people were doing. The other things that people said they were doing were waking up in the middle of the night and having a short temper with their colleagues or their family. The other thing that they were doing was working really long hours, working on weekends, endlessly thinking about things even when they weren't working, right? Trying to perfect things in that way. So that's perfectionism through the lens of what you're thinking, feeling, and doing. And it's worth just thinking a little bit about what all of that is creating. Like, what is the result of that in your day or in your life? And people told me that the result for them was that they were exhausted. They were stressed. They thought about quitting their job, which they'd trained really hard for. They were overwhelmed. Again, they ended up working really long hours. So we started this episode by my friend's perhaps not great advice that telling somebody you're a perfectionist is a good thing. It's a weakness dressed up as a strength, or a strength dressed up as a weakness. That was it. But from what we've just gone through there, it doesn't sound much like a strength, does it? It sounds like something that's creating a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of difficulty for people. So now I want to think with you, if this is something that you're experiencing and that you have experienced in your career, first off, I want you to know that it is possible to go from where you are now to something that feels a little bit more chilled. I've coached loads of people on perfectionism before, and you definitely can get to a place where you're feeling a lot more confident and happy with less perfectionism. But I've distilled it into 5 things that I think you need to know as you're on your journey towards rethinking perfectionism. And those 5 things are: 1, just keep noticing what's happening. I've asked you to think about what you're thinking, feeling, and doing. Keep doing that. Then number 2, I'm going to teach you how to test your thinking. Test what you're thinking and believing. Is it really right? Number 3, we're going to look at deciding on a standard for your work rather than using a default standard. Maybe even deciding on a standard for yourself rather than using your default standard of perfect. 4, we're going to look at adopting a growth mindset. And 5, we're going to look at how we speak to ourselves. So minding our critical thinking. So number 1 is just keep noticing. I want you to try and be a detective of your own thinking, feeling, and doing. Now you've called some stuff to mind, maybe heard some thoughts and feelings and actions that resonated with you. Notice those when you're going through your day-to-day life. When you're at work and this stuff is happening, notice it in the moment. It's a very powerful first step towards changing it, because if you never notice it and it's just happening and you just accept that's the way life is, nothing's ever going to change. But if you can start to notice it, to do something about it, So that's number one, just keep noticing and resist the temptation to judge yourself for it. That's not going to help. It's going to make things worse. So we're not judging, we're just noticing. All right, number two, test your thinking. So when we looked earlier at what we were thinking about perfectionism, I said that it was what you were thinking and believing that was ruling the whole thing. It was creating your feelings, and your feelings were driving what you were doing. So we want to go back almost to the mothership, which is the thoughts and beliefs which are in your brain around perfectionism. Now, most of us think that the thoughts that flow through our head are just like a factual reading of every scenario. They are not. They're more like a load of like ideas and suppositions and bullshit and just some random thing my brain's coming out with, right? They are not facts. They never have been. So don't fall into the trap of believing that everything your brain comes out with is true. But I want you to be able to actually have some critical analysis when it comes to your brain. You wouldn't open the Daily Mail and be like, oh, everything in here must be true. That's like looking at the thoughts in your brain, looking at the way your brain operates unconsciously and being like, well, this must just be the correct way of doing things. No, my friends, you wouldn't open the Daily Mail and be like, oh, well, this must all be accurate. You'd be like, this is like racist, misogynist, homophobic bullshit. Treat your brain with the same level of skepticism. Now, I'm not saying your brain is exactly like the Daily Mail, right? But you see the point. Just believing everything your brain comes out with is a recipe for disaster. Don't do it. So let's say you're thinking the thought, this has to be perfect. I want you to really question whether or not that's actually true. I coached someone in the training session this week that was thinking, this has to be perfect, right? And it was an email. It was an email that was going to a senior person in their team. And when I asked them, okay, can you absolutely know that that's true? Does this have to be perfect? They laughed. And I was like, well, why are you laughing? And they said, because actually it really doesn't have to be perfect. And I was like, okay, tell me why. And they said, well, it's just an email and I'm unlikely to get fired if there's a typo. And I can trust myself because usually my emails are pretty good and it's a casual method of communication. And I was like, okay. Right, so we just tested one tiny little thought, this email has to be perfect. And we found that it wasn't true. And actually, it just crumbled to dust as soon as we looked at it. So beware of believing everything you think and start to test some of your assumptions around perfectionism. Number 3 is deciding on a standard versus using a default standard. So what your brain's essentially doing when you are a perfectionist is it is assuming that everything, and I mean everything, has to be perfect. And then you just go ahead and apply that standard to everything you do. Now, our brains love to be efficient. So if it can have one rule for everything, perfect, great, very efficient, doesn't have to use much energy, you don't have to eat as much food, you're less likely to die. But there is nuance in the stuff that you do. Some stuff that you do has to be more perfect than others. Maybe if you're providing an advice to a client, that has to be really perfect. If you're providing a report to a board, maybe that has to be quite perfect. But what if you're just drafting something, you're getting something out, you're doing a start for 10, you're sending an email, right? Not all of this stuff has to be 100%. So I want you to think about consciously choosing your standard for success on every piece of work that you do if you're a perfectionist and you're committed to doing something about this. Beginning of the piece of work, think, does this have to be 100% or is this a 95 job? Is this even an 80% piece of work? Maybe it's even a 50% piece of work. But I want you to consciously decide instead of just using your brain's default standard, because if you're a perfectionist, your brain's default standard will be perfect. And our brains are lazy, so they're just going to apply that to everything, right? You can take control by actually thinking about it and deciding this is a 75%er and 25% is success, 75% is a job well done. Brilliant. I'm going to encourage you to use that in every single piece of work that you do. Now, number 4 is adopt a growth mindset. So a growth mindset is the belief that your skills and abilities can be developed. Often what I find with people who will call themselves perfectionists is that mindsets can be quite fixed. And a fixed mindset is the belief that our skills and our abilities are innate, therefore fixed. So I'm either good or I'm not. I used to have a really fixed mindset around maths. I used to be like, oh, I'm just crap at maths. Well, guess what? You never get any better at maths when you think that you're crap at maths. I had a very fixed mindset. If I'd had a growth mindset, it would have looked more like, well, maybe maths isn't my best subject, but I can keep trying. I know that I'll definitely see improvements. It's like an opening rather than a closing. So where are you being fixed-minded about your work right now? Is there a new thing that you would like to do, but because you're a perfectionist, you're like, can't touch something new because it might not be perfect and that would be terrible? Could you use a growth mindset and say, well, maybe it's not great now, but it could be if I keep trying and keep going. Could get better. How could you use a growth mindset to help you not have to have everything so perfect from the word go? Maybe a growth mindset helps you to be a beginner and to try some new things. And yeah, they're not going to be perfect. And I accept that because I have a growth mindset. And I know that my skills and abilities can be developed. I wasn't born with them. I'm working them. All right. So that was number 4, adopt a growth mindset. Number 5, and this is the last tip I have for you, is mind your self-critical thinking. So perfectionists can be very hard on themselves. Are you hard on yourself? They can set up a negative cycle of perfect standards and then beat themselves up for not reaching them. What a hideous cycle to be in that would be. And like most people, perfectionists can assume that self-criticism is a great way of managing ourselves. We're like, yeah, I want to be managed by a leader who's like kind and compassionate and understanding and encouraging. And when it comes to the voice in our own brain, we're like critical, judgy, mean, rude. Very different. What self-criticism does is it erodes our confidence. It creates stress and anxiety, and it makes it harder to do tasks. So if you are a perfectionism and you're like, oh yeah, that's me, own worst critic, terrible self-critical thinking, that is something you're going to want to do something about. Because I can't imagine it's very nice working with the boss in your brain spends all day, every day being a total bitch to you. So just notice where you're being self-critical and where maybe you could just go a little gentler on yourself. All right, that's the tips and tools I have for you today. But what I'm going to ask you to do is set an intention. So I'm sure you've had a lovely time listening to this episode about perfectionism with me, which actually has been the worst episode I've ever recorded because I have a new computer, right? I got a MacBook, all fancy. But every 5 minutes it cuts me off and I've had to go back and restart and hash these all together. So if this episode sounds terrible, that's why. But I thought it was quite funny that it was an episode about perfectionism. It was so far from perfect. So I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm just going to leave it. I'll just practice not being a perfectionist. Last thing. I am currently selling the September 22 group coaching program, Confident at Work. This is for female professionals who want to grow their confidence and get the skills, tools, and knowledge they need to maintain it over the course of their career. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be our best round yet. I think this is round number 4. We already have people booked in. There are 15 places. And if this is the kind of thing that you like, this program is going to be for you. Have a look in the show notes. Find out how you can join us.